Welcome to the In Court podcast, the podcast where we delve into the trials and tribulations of the courtroom. My name is Nina Tornquist and I'm a criminologist at Uppsala University, Sweden. My research centers on the worlds of legal professionals with a particular focus on emotion and legal decision making. I have observed criminal court cases in Sweden for almost a decade.
My name is Chloe Squires and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Lancaster University. My PhD work looked at the sentencing of individuals charged with terrorism offences, and I observed court proceedings in England and Wales.
My name is Nicole Bögelein. I'm a sociologist and criminologist at the University of Cologne in Germany. My work focuses on institutional racism in court and terrorism cases. For several months, I have observed courtroom hearings on low-level offences in German district courts. In this podcast, we dive into complexities we have identified throughout our times observing legal proceedings to demystify what happens in the courtroom.
My name is Jackie Hodgson. I work in the School of Law at the University of Warwick in the UK, and my work is across a broad range of criminal justice areas. It is principally empirical, a lot of it is comparative, focused around due process and fair trial rights. And then in the last 4 or 5 years, I've developed this new area of work around creative methods, particularly focusing on the criminal justice process and latterly on anti-racism training with the police.
Welcome, Jackie. We're really pleased to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us. We know of a project of yours in which you try to reshape the police community engagement from what you describe as sometimes hostile to more positive and sustainable. The whole project was part of the Coventry UK City of Culture in 2021. The important bit was that it was really a cooperation between academics and artists, and that was the core of the project. Like when I heard you talk about it before, and I also had the opportunity to see some bits of the project, I think that was the key element. Could you explain for our listeners very briefly what exactly the creative methods were that you used in the former project?
Very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So the kinds of things that we did, we started off with just some quite simple free writing. And so officers, we asked, for a couple of provocations. For example, what would you tell your younger self, before you thought about applying for the police? Those kinds of things. We asked them to think about what their ideal day would look like, both at work and at home. And just as ways of raising issues and talking about things in a very, very easy sort of space. And there are overlaps between creative methods, as we might call them, and also some of the pedagogic techniques we might use in our academic teaching as well. Then we asked them to do some creative writing, some free writing. Some of them wrote some poetry. And then probably the most powerful, I think, was when we took some provocations, various stimuli, a news story. We took something from Coventry City of Culture, which was a story about a set of firearms officers who'd bashed down the door of a house very early in the morning, and the impact it had on the young woman, the daughter, who was living in that house. So the police took that incident and then they wrote a script around it, thinking, how would it be for that young woman? What was she thinking when she then had to go into school and she was late for her exam and she had to explain that? And what was going through the police officers' minds in the way that they're trained to behave? And what about if we followed them up a year later and said, so how does it look now and what has been the impact and so on? And that was incredibly powerful because I watched them writing that script. And as they wrote that script, one of the officers became very distressed and kind of recognized herself in that script, in that situation, and said, I'm one of the good ones. I'm a mum. I joined for the right reasons and she had to step away. She was upset. So it had this kind of triggering effect on her. So obviously we were all very concerned to make sure that she was okay and so on. So that was very powerful to see how the developing of an essentially fictionalized script could then have that incredible emotional connection for that person. And we did a sharing at the end where the things that the officers had created were played out by professional actors, and we had some senior officers who were involved in this was all part of this national police race action plan work, some officers who were leads on that. And I think they were pretty blown away to think, if you looked at the play, you thought, gosh, that's quite powerful. If you're told that police officers wrote it, and these were not favourable to police, kind of, really appreciating these different perspectives, as well as appreciating that the police have to do a job and so on. So that was very powerful. And then another thing that we did that was a bit more kind of classic forum theatre. This is part of a body of work that dates back to Coventry, UK City of Culture. And one of the things that I did with my co-investigator, Dr. Rachel Lewis, who's also at the University of Warwick, is we co-commissioned a play with the Belgrade Theatre. And so we took just a scene from that play, and it's a character called Slick, who's a young black man, and he's in the centre of Coventry, and he's quite upbeat and he's quite amusing, and he's talking about, oh, it's a really sunny day and I'm going to go off to the chicken shop and I'm going to do this. And then he sees some police officers and a whole load of vans and describes how this is kind of in his DNA to run in the other direction. As a young black man, this is not where he wants to be going. So we told the police officers about this scene and asked them about that, and some of them were confused as to why this young black man would be wary of the police and did not recognise that they were seen as a source of danger. They always would understand themselves as a source of safety. And then we acted out the scene. And the first time we acted out the scene, that was fine. And the Slick character, we got him to actually walk towards the police, and the police saying, oh, yes, we're just here. There's been a bit of a disturbance, and he passes through and it's fine. And then the second time, he changes his demeanour and he has a different attitude, and he's got a bit of swagger, and he's like looking pretty cross, and he's sucking his teeth, and he's like, what are you doing here? This is like my kind of area, and blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't do anything, and he hasn't done anything, and they know he's not a criminal and so on. But just as he starts to do that, straight away, the officer's body language changed and they just square up to him. And then, before you know it, one of the male officers has got the actor's arm up his back in an arm lock. And so we have to call time on the thing because we're worried about Kieran. And it was really instructive. And it's an example I give when people think, oh, you're doing all this fluffy stuff with officers and, there's a bit of acting and, no one's going to take it seriously. It's like, oh, they really do. It pulls you into the moment. And so we then have a discussion about, so why did you behave like that? How might you do that differently? What might you do? And so, one officer said, well, I guess I would look to see what I could do to construct some reasonable suspicion to justify the actions. And the other officers sort of had their head in their hands saying, no, that's not what we do. And it was almost like he'd been a little bit too honest and kind of naive. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a flavour. And I think it was really important for our creative collaborators that this wasn't just about the work that we were doing in the workshops and getting the police to understand things in different ways. It was also about the police creating something that really is part of the story, is part of the method for them to immerse themselves and to create, whether it's a piece of creative writing, poetry, sort of duologue that can be acted out and so on. And as I say, we had a sharing that lasted about an hour, which we filmed and in front of our advisory group and senior officers.
So we are a court podcast, not so much a police podcast. And you have worked on the upsides and downsides of this approach in working with the police. And we wondered, do you think the very same project would be feasible in a courtroom surrounding? Like, instead of working around the relationship between police and the public, do you think it would be possible to shape something similar around the relationship between court and the public or defendants, lawyers, etc.?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So yes, using creative methods. Yes, that was part of Coventry UK City of Culture. At that point, not working on a project like this, but much more an evaluation and an observation, therefore, of actually how was that working, using those creative methods in collaboration between artists and creatives locally in Coventry and the police, and also members of the community. And as you say, that was about trying to reshape some of those relationships that had been hostile and trying to see whether using those creative approaches, that idea of being engaged in a collaborative endeavour, might help to open up some spaces of trust. So there was a bunch of work around that. And then we flipped that around and we thought, well, rather than always looking at the community and getting the community to trust and getting the community to change, really it's the police that need to change. And so how about we flip the lens and we put the kind of spotlight onto the police and how might we use some creative methods there to get them to think differently, to perhaps connect in more empathetic ways, and if they just understand perspectives differently, maybe that will change their practice and their outlook. So when you're asking about the courtroom, I guess it could be a similar thing, because essentially it's about the potential that creative methods have to use emotional engagement as a way of underpinning empathy. So you can't train empathy, but you can do quite a lot towards that. And so as a bit of, you might talk about walking in someone else's shoes or those kinds of ideas. And one of the things I think that's worked really well is taking some kind of piece of theatre, some kind of dramatic narrative, and then asking the police to engage with that. And it will often really resonate with their own experiences. But rather than having them to say, I do this, I think this, it can then be the they. So moving from the I to the they, putting that distance there, makes it a safer space for them to engage in something that's quite difficult, which in the work we've been doing with the police is around anti-racism. So I think it might be interesting, I guess, you could imagine doing something with judges to think, okay, let's have a think about the kind of defendants who are in front of you. And yes, many of them have committed criminal offences and so on, but let's take a bit of time that you wouldn't normally have to think about their background and how they came to where you are. So you could imagine using some fictionalized narratives, some little vignettes that are perhaps based on people's real lives, and then getting judges to engage with that a little bit, using forum theatre where they then actually intervene and become part of the dramatic dialogue that's going on, and thinking about also then how would you do things differently. So essentially it's an understanding, how does that character feel? And as I say, I think it's always easier to do it in that sort of slightly more indirect way, so it's not too personal, so you don't feel so judged. So it does feel a bit safer to talk about things that are complex, sensitive, often contested. I think it would be possible, and so on.
Thanks, Jackie. So if I understand correctly, the methods you use were to help understand and remedy kind of hostilities and mistrust between the public and policing. And I just wanted to know, really, how did you establish buy-in from both of the different parties? Because if there's this hostility, there might be a reticence or a reluctance to kind of engage. So I wonder how you established that in your methods.
So for the original work around Coventry UK City of Culture, that was police-led. The police were principal partners in City of Culture, and so they kind of set up those collaborations and so on. So they did all the work and we came along and evaluated it. For this work that we're doing now, this is very much focused on the police. So we're not needing buy-in from the community, we are from the police. And you're absolutely right that, if we had just called a police force and asked to do that, that probably would have been really difficult. But I think because we had done the evaluation and we had an evidence base for what we were proposing, and because the person who had been the commander in Coventry during Coventry City of Culture is an assistant chief constable who has the police race action plan in his strategic portfolio, he's kind of on board. So he understands, he has seen firsthand the power of creative methods, and understands that then, there are 6,000 or 8,000 police officers in West Midlands Police. And so generally training is what they call click and skip, because it's online and they're just trying to get through it. And I should say we did an evaluation of our own Project Seychat, which is what we called this work we've been doing with the officers. And in that evaluation, one of the things that the officers said was how much they valued having the time to reflect on these things, because they needed to unpack difficult, complex, sensitive things that were hard to talk about. Are we using the right words? We're not quite sure how we should talk about race, or we don't quite understand this in the race action plan. So having that officers buy-in, and then us having that evidence and saying, so this is what we're proposing. Here are some creatives that we've collaborated with before and that the police have been a little bit involved in when we did the co-commissioning of the play. We did some work with police and with local schools. This is what we're proposing, this is our programme, and so on. And then we had to really kind of lean on that officer to then get buy-in from, the force exec team. And because we had to abstract officers, or they had to abstract officers, there were 4 3-hour sessions and then a 3-hour sharing. So that was 15 hours, which doesn't sound much, but it's actually a huge amount for some of that police training. And what I haven't talked about is the second phase, which is what we're just about to embark on in about 2 weeks' time, that we've been planning, which is with they're called SPOCs, single points of contact. And the idea there is that we do some of the work using the creative methods with them, but we also just equip them a little bit with some tools to think about how they might use some of those things just in quite small ways in their work with teams, in their work with communities, rather than just going in and doing the sort of traditional modes of we'll just come in and talk to you or at you or, and so on. And so again, that's, we've had to kind of get that buy-in, that abstraction, but we're hoping this will be more sustainable because this will be a way of then the information kind of, cascading down and those methods, and it becomes this sort of like, I don't know whether it's a domino effect or a pyramid scheme or, what quite the analogy is. And in that we have what they are calling themselves early adopters. So these are the people who from Seychat last year were really, really blown away by this and have really bought in to this. And so they're quite keen to be involved. And so one of them is an inspector, which is the level that you need to be for this second phase. And so it's going to be really good to have him in the room, I think, as we're working with these officers on new things, and we'll have someone who has had that experience last year. And so I think can really help that bridge, because there's all, we're academics, we're creatives, and there's police, we all inhabit very different worlds. And so sometimes we were worried about there being a credibility gap. But again, I think because it's underpinned by research, that's been a really important thing for the police as well.
Do you know what impact the methods have had on kind of policing practice or policing outcomes?
So that's obviously that would be, the kind of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is if that changes behaviour. We certainly know at the beginning of that, we asked whether police officers thought that creative methods could be a valuable way of changing their understanding of relationships with the public, changing their, not so much practice, I guess, but yeah, certainly their understanding. And 13% thought that at the beginning, and at the end it was around 70.
Wow.
So I think we could really show that, they had bought into those methods. For them, they felt it had really kind of catalyzed some kind of change in the way that they were thinking and understanding and so on. What we're going to try to do is to see if we can get those officers together a year later and just say to them, so has anything changed? Are you doing things in your teams? Are you doing things in your practice? So obviously, they could say, oh, we're doing all kinds of fabulous things, and they're not. We're not saying that's kind of cast iron evidence. But I think it would be interesting, and it would be sad if they said, oh, it was really great, but when we got back in our teams, we just couldn't find space, or we didn't have the confidence. Or so in this second phase, we're also going to have a toolkit. Nothing too much, nothing too over the top, just something realistic that would be a few resources that the police could perhaps use. So, for example, the scene I described before with the firearms officer, we've recorded that now as a really high quality audio recording. And that could be something that the police might use in teams as just as a provocation to then have some discussion about the impact of their policing on communities, the impact on people who've done nothing wrong, but are, as they would see it, almost collateral damage if they even think about it at all.
So many interesting points to pick up on. I was thinking a little bit more about your background and how you came to the creative methods. Where did your journey start in going into this area, which is quite new for many researchers?
Yep. So my background originally has always been doing empirical work, qualitative work, ethnographic work, and it's been comparative criminal justice, fair trial rights, really on the other end of things from police, really being very critical of policing. And in a way, it was almost serendipitous. I had a university role as a Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research. It was when it was Coventry, UK City of Culture. That was in my portfolio, and one of my tasks was effectively to animate a programme of research around City of Culture. So connecting with creatives, with local authority, with local voluntary organisations, all kinds of strands of the community, essentially. And I also co-direct the Centre for Operational Police Research, COPPA. And as I mentioned before, West Midlands Police were principal partners in City of Culture. And so it was important for them to have an evaluation of that work. And so because I was involved as a deputy PVC, because I ran this policing centre, we put, there was a sort of call, for put out to tender for bids. So I put in a bid and they asked us to do the work. And that's really when it started. So that would have been in about 2021, I guess. And so, we did over 100 interviews and focus groups, and evaluating that was a really big piece of work. And so we learned a lot about what worked and what didn't work. But we were really struck by the fact that the focus was on the community. We need the community to trust us, and the idea of the community needing to change. And I think as social scientists, as my colleague Rachel is a sociologist, I'm a sociolegal lawyer, we thought, okay, no, we think actually the focus needs to be on the police. And there's somebody in the learning and development team at West Midlands Police who has an arts background. And she's always been this really useful bridge for us between academia and the police via a creative method. And so she had said to us, what about the race action plan? This could work really well. What do you think? And so she gave us the idea. And then, as I say, because the same officer was an assistant chief constable who had been involved and so on, so we were able to kind of get some buy-in from him. So that's really kind of how it worked. It was evaluating what had happened in other projects, understanding what works and doesn't work. And then we had a few other projects before we got to the police. So we had one where we were working with young people, and we wanted them, through working with some actors and doing some creative work, again, it was like a little bit of forum theatre, to get them to think about what makes them feel safe and what their perceptions. The idea of policing was introduced sort of just a little bit indirectly or picked up when they introduced it. But we asked them to think about power and authority and what makes them feel safe, because we wanted it to be a bit more shaped by them rather than us going in with sort of 10 questions. So that was interesting to see the way that was a much more open textured approach that allowed things to kind of come in. I mean, obviously it was steered. It wasn't, completely open and random. But I think there was space for things to be said and themes to come out. And then similarly with the co-commissioning of the play After Preston, we did a focus group with the police. We did some work with schools before and after the play. And we also had a big sort of 2-hour after show discussion after the play was performed with criminal justice practitioners, with creatives, academics, and some policy people. And again, just seeing how people responded to what was in the play, seeing how certain things really chimed with them and just made them think about policing a little bit differently and so on was really instructive. So all of those things, I think then we felt able to, okay, now we'll try and do this work with the police. But we're working with a director, dramaturg and 2 actors. And so, they are the creatives. They absolutely lead on all of that. We're not academics pretending to be creative. That would be kind of quite offensive, really. So it absolutely has to be a collaboration.
So with all these learnings you've taken away from that project, and coming back to my question in the beginning, because you are a courtroom researcher and you've done extensive work on courts and courtrooms, do you think the difference that I see between police work and the work in a courtroom is that the police decides who they go to in many cases and they decide how they react? In a courtroom, things are very formalized, and the way how people are supposed to behave and what they're supposed to say is not by chance. Is there a necessity to make professionals in courtrooms aware of how they interact with the public, or do you think that's not a space where work like that would be required?
I think in current judicial training, not necessarily using creative methods, but I think that is recognised as being really important, that you need to understand the person in front of you. This is not someone, you don't just see the offence, you have to see the offender. I think it's certainly in England and Wales, it's probation who do a lot of that work, and their role has become a bit more policing-ish. So that is perhaps problematic. Is there a need? I guess, for me, there's more of a need in policing because, as you say, it is the police who decide, essentially. They are the frontline officers in terms of who gets sucked into the criminal justice system. They're the ones, essentially who determine that. They're the gatekeepers, really, to the criminal justice process. And there feels to me much more urgency in terms of malpractice in policing and in terms of the consequences of that. So the Police Race Action Plan is a response to, people are talking about Black Lives Matter, or we've had countless inquiries and reports, but this is not new. Yes, we can go back to Stephen Lawrence. Yes, we can go back to the Brixton riots in the 1980s. There's always been an issue around the disproportionate policing of Black communities, the disproportionate use of force, more people dying in custody, the experience for Black people in particular throughout the criminal justice system. And so it feels like that is something that's we need to change it at the front door, as it were. So that's not to say that there wouldn't be some value in doing that in courts, and it may engage an empathetic response in perhaps a slightly different way if one did that, and just sort of understanding a little bit the people in front of them. So I saw a really great play that had been produced recently in collaboration with people with lived experience of the criminal justice process. And it really brought out what an obstacle course it is if you're released from prison, let's imagine, and you have to be in a probation hostel. And then you get moved and you turn up and it's 4 o'clock. Well, no, you've missed now. You can't wash your clothes now until Thursday. That's our rule. No kettles in your room. Well, I really need a hot chocolate to be able to sleep. Well, you'll have to make it at 4 o'clock. And these are conversations that have been had. And then people who are being detained, they're having a meeting with the person who is running the probation hostel. And so they're stuck in that meeting, which then makes them late for their meeting with their probation officer, who's saying, come on, you're 10 minutes late. This is like several times this has happened. I'm going to have to breach you. Whereas when the probation officer is late, nothing happens. And so just through this play, these experiences were brought out. And I just thought that's something when you're sitting there in court, you might think, okay, I can see from your background, you've not had an easy life. Various things have happened, or in terms of poverty or employment or, whatever. But I think just seeing how that fits together and seeing how dysfunctional the criminal justice process sometimes is towards those people. And it sounds like they're just moaning all the time. But, when you've got no money, you run out of charge, you run out of credit on your phone. You see people in court who haven't got enough money for the bus fare. And so every adjournment is really problematic for them because they have to come back in and so on. And for a variety of reasons that are not necessarily blameworthy, they have quite chaotic lifestyles sometimes. So there are many things, I think, there that I can imagine something like those sort of, the forum theatre, or getting people to write scenarios in a way that gets them to engage with the situations of those people that they are effectively passing judgment on. I can absolutely see a value in that.
You mentioned that the ultimate goal, as I understood it, is finding this altering self or transformative moments, or maybe significant moments for the participants in altering their understanding of their professional practices, but also their selves. But you also talked about, from a research perspective, that you were cautious that it would be a safe space for the participants, and different ways to do that, speaking about they instead of I. So drawing on the lessons that you have learned from doing this project, were there any instances where you felt that you couldn't provide a safe space for the participants? Anything that you would do differently today?
So we thought about that quite a lot at the beginning, and we were conscious that we may be taking officers into territory that was distressing and it could be triggering. And so we said, okay, we need to know what support either we can put in place or is available in force. So in the very first meeting, we reminded officers these are the places, and we had a kind of participant information leaflet, of course, because we needed officers to consent. Because we were present in these sessions, and it sort of had a kind of dual purpose. We also were interested in what we learned about police through their engagement in these particular ways. So we did that. Whether or not people think, oh yes, these are just these organizations within the police, and I mean, we don't really have any control of that. And we did follow up with a person who was quite distressed. We followed up with her, and I know that 2 of her colleagues followed up with her, and to make sure that she was okay and so on. But I think that was the only time when we had a concern for somebody's well-being. I think anything else that got a little bit tricky, I think, was resolved within the session. So there's also, there was one issue that was tricky around language and words that you wouldn't say. So you would say the N word, and then somebody saying, what does that mean? And then saying the word. And that was then quite distressing for people, particularly people of colour who were in the room. So there are things that you can't predict. Yeah, so I don't think there's anything we would have done differently, because we did spend quite a bit of time. And I guess the other thing to mention is we did a pilot of 2 sessions before we embarked on Project Seychat, and we did that with a group of officers who were really very resistant, and the creatives in particular found that very difficult. And so what we did is when we set up the full project, we put in place a kind of, I don't know what her proper title is, but this was somebody who would be a kind of, she herself, I think, is a creative, but she's also a therapeutic counsellor. And so we put in place 3 sessions so that our creatives could go and have some time, a bit like a therapist would have supervisions with other therapists, so that they could go and talk about what had happened, but also perhaps if they were anxious about some issues that we were going to be dealing with in the next sessions. So I think that was really good support for them. And in Project Seychat, I guess we were better prepared, but also the cohort of officers was a little bit different, so we didn't get so much pushback. In the pilot, it was a team, and we learned we don't want a team because they are actually quite cliquey. There's a particular way they behave. Some of them, there'll be the dominant character, and others are afraid to speak in front of them. So in Project Seychat, we had people drawn from teams right across the West Midlands. So they were kind of all like, oh, here are these people. We're not all, kind of teammates together or friends and so on, which I think made them a lot more open. And so they didn't kind of, gang up together against us. It was a much more collaborative endeavour as the whole workshop.
So, Jackie, we could have talked to you for much longer, but our time's up. Thank you very much for taking part in this and for letting us into your expertise. And we're looking forward to the next episode. Bis zum nächsten Mal. See you later.
Vi hörs!
Blues.